Imagine 30,000 of the most feared warriors the world had ever seen, riding through a frozen Polish winter, their breath rising like smoke above the snow-covered plains. These men had never lost a war. They had broken empires. They had reduced great cities to smoking rubble. They had made kings weep and generals surrender without a fight. And yet, within weeks of crossing into Poland in December of 1287, something would happen that shook the very foundations of the Mongol Empire's reputation, something that nobody, not their generals, not their spies, not their shamans, had predicted. They would be destroyed. Not slowly eroded, not pushed back with heavy losses, destroyed. And the story of how that happened is one of the most extraordinary reversals in all of medieval history. This is not just a story about a battle. This is a story about what happens when a civilization refuses to die, when a people, battered and burned and enslaved, rise from their ashes and forge themselves into something the enemy never expected, something harder, something smarter, something unbreakable. This is the story of how Poland set a trap that the Mongol world would never forget and never dare to repeat. To truly feel the weight of what happened in 1287 and 1288, you have to go back further. You have to understand what the Mongols actually were, not just as warriors, but as a system, a machine, an idea made of horsemen and fire. By the time the great Mongol war machine turned its eyes toward Europe in the 13th century, it had already consumed most of the known world. Genghis Khan had died in 1227, but the empire he built continued expanding long after his body was cold in the earth. His sons and grandsons carried his vision westward with a ferocity that defied description. The Jin dynasty of northern China had collapsed beneath Mongol hooves. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had stretched across Central Asia like a colossus, had been so completely annihilated that its very memory was nearly erased. The great cities of Persia, Samarkand, Merv, and Nishapur, cities of scholars and poets and merchants, were reduced to mass graves. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the rivers ran black with the ink of burned books and red with the blood of the slaughtered. These were not exaggerations. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of the devastation. Populations that had numbered in the millions were simply gone. And then the Mongols turned toward Europe. What made the Mongol army so terrifying was not simply its size, though it was enormous. It was the sophistication of its methods. The Mongols had developed what was, for the 13th century, a genuinely revolutionary approach to warfare. Every soldier was a horseman, and every horseman had been riding since before he could walk. The relationship between a Mongol warrior and his horse was not merely practical, it was cultural, spiritual, and tactical all at once. A Mongol cavalryman could eat in the saddle, sleep in the saddle, and most devastatingly of all, fight in the saddle, with a degree of accuracy and speed that European armies found almost incomprehensible. Their composite bows were engineering marvels. Built from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, these weapons could drive an arrow through armor at distances that contemporary European longbows struggled to match. A Mongol horse archer, galloping at full speed, could release multiple accurate shots in the time it took a European knight to close half the distance between them. And if the knight did close that distance, the Mongol would simply wheel away, maintaining the gap, pouring arrows into his frustrated pursuer. But it was the feigned retreat that truly separated the Mongols from every other cavalry force of the era. This tactic, known in military scholarship as the Parthian shot combined with false flight, was devastatingly simple and almost impossible to counter if you had never seen it before. Mongol units would engage an enemy, trade blows briefly, and then suddenly appear to panic and flee. The enemy, convinced they were winning, would break formation in pursuit, exactly as cavalry was trained to do, exactly as instinct demanded, and then the trap would close. Hidden flanking units would emerge, the fleeing Mongols would wheel around, and the pursuing soldiers would find themselves surrounded, disorganized, and slaughtered. This was not a trick that worked once and then lost its power. It worked again and again, because the discipline required to not chase a fleeing enemy was almost superhuman. It went against every instinct. It contradicted every tradition of knightly warfare, which prized the aggressive charge as the pinnacle of martial valor. The Mongols had studied human psychology as carefully as they had studied terrain and logistics, and they exploited both without mercy. When Batu Khan and Subutai led the first great Mongol invasion of Poland in February of 1241, they found exactly the kind of enemy they had planned for: fragmented, proud, undisciplined in exactly the ways that Mongol tactics could exploit. The Polish duchies were not unified under a single king. Each duke ruled his own territory with his own army, and the coordination between them was slow, incomplete, and often poisoned by political rivalry. The Mongols, whose intelligence networks had spent years mapping Polish political divisions, knew this. They planned for it.
The destruction that followed was almost biblical in its completeness. The Mongols did not advance on a single front as a European army might. They split into multiple columns and struck simultaneously across a broad front, making it impossible for the Polish defenders to concentrate their forces at any single point. The city of Sandomierz fell. Kraków, the crown jewel of Polish civilization, was taken and burned. The wooden walls that had seemed so formidable to Polish eyes proved laughably inadequate against an enemy who had perfected the art of siege warfare across the steppes of Asia and the walled cities of China. Then came the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. Duke Henry II, called the Pious, had assembled the largest Polish army he could manage. There were Silesian knights, infantry from Greater Poland, units from Opole, and even a contingent of Knights Templar dispatched by a papacy desperately hoping that crusading zeal might accomplish what military organization had failed to do. Henry marched with real hope. What he encountered was a masterclass in everything the Mongols did best. The Mongols used smokescreens to blind Polish commanders and prevent them from reading the battlefield. They used their feigned retreat tactic with surgical precision, drawing Polish cavalry forward and away from the supporting infantry. They used flanking units that appeared from directions the Polish commanders had not anticipated. And they used speed, always speed, the terrifying, disorienting speed that made it feel as though the enemy was everywhere at once and nowhere you could catch them. Henry II died on that field. The stories that survived him were not glorious tales of knightly sacrifice that medieval culture preferred to tell about its fallen heroes. His body was so mutilated that his widow could only identify him by a physical peculiarity: 6 toes on his left foot. The Mongols mounted his head on a spear and carried it to the walls of nearby cities. The message was delivered in a language that required no translation. This is what happens to those who resist. A second invasion came in 1259, following the same brutal logic. Sandomierz burned again, Kraków burned again, Lublin, Zawichost, Bytom all sacked for a second time within 20 years. For the people who survived both invasions, the Mongols had ceased to be merely an enemy. They had become something closer to a force of nature, a recurring catastrophe as inevitable as winter and as impossible to prevent as plague. But it is precisely at this point, in the smoldering aftermath of the second invasion, that the most important part of our story begins. Because while chronicles record destruction, what they often fail to capture is what happens inside a civilization that survives catastrophe. What happens to the thinking of the people who are left? What decisions get made in the quiet years between disasters, when the dead have been buried and the ruins have been swept away, and serious men sit around fires and ask the hard question that pride usually prevents people from asking? What did we do wrong, and how do we make sure it never happens again? Duke Boleslav V, called the Chaste, had witnessed the second invasion. His advisors and military commanders had witnessed it too. And unlike the comfortable delusion that many rulers throughout history have embraced, the idea that the next time will somehow be different without changing anything, the Polish leadership drew brutally honest conclusions. The wooden fortifications had failed. The absence of unified command had failed. The tradition of aggressive cavalry charges had failed against an enemy specifically designed to exploit them. Almost everything about the way Poland had been defending itself had been systematically dismantled by an enemy that had studied it in advance. What followed was one of the most remarkable, least celebrated military transformation programs in medieval history. The decision was made across multiple duchies and over multiple decades to rebuild the kingdom's defensive infrastructure in stone, not merely to patch the wooden walls or reinforce the gates, to replace them entirely with something that fire could not consume and arrows could not penetrate. This was not a small undertaking. Stone construction in the 13th century was enormously expensive, requiring skilled craftsmen, extensive quarrying operations, and the kind of long-term planning that political systems built around individual rulers often struggled to sustain. But the memory of the Mongols was a powerful motivator. Krakow's transformation was the most dramatic and the most consequential. The old wooden citadel on Wawel Hill, which had fallen in 1241 almost without slowing the invaders down, was systematically replaced with a castle built entirely of stone. The walls were designed with the specific intention of withstanding sustained assault. The towers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, meaning that an attacker approaching any section of the wall would simultaneously be exposed to projectiles from multiple directions. Along those walls, the defenders installed crossbows of both large and small varieties, as well as catapults capable of hurling stones into attacking formations at considerable distance. This last detail is worth pausing on because it reveals a sophistication in Polish defensive thinking that often gets overlooked. The Mongols' cavalry's most devastating quality in open battle was its ability to maintain distance from the enemy while dealing damage through arrow fire. But that advantage evaporated in a siege context if the defenders had their own ranged weapons capable of reaching the attackers before the attackers could effectively engage the walls. By installing heavy crossbows and catapults at Kraków, the Polish defenders were essentially creating a kill zone around the city's perimeter, a zone where Mongol horse archers would come under fire before they were close enough to do meaningful damage to the walls or their defenders.
Sandomir received similar upgrades. So did the fortifications at Wislica. Across the region of Lesser Poland, scores of strongholds that had previously been wood and earthwork were converted to stone and mortar over the course of the 1260s and 1270s. The work was unglamorous. It generated no songs, no great heroic narratives. But it represented something more valuable than heroism. It represented institutional learning. It represented a society that had looked at its own failures honestly and decided to change. Alongside the physical rebuilding came a shift in military doctrine that was equally important, if less visible. Polish commanders began studying Mongol tactics not merely to understand them, but to develop specific counters. The feigned retreat worked because European knights were trained and culturally conditioned to pursue fleeing enemies. What if Polish cavalry were trained to hold their positions even when the enemy appeared to flee? What if infantry and cavalry were drilled to work in coordination rather than in the separate spheres that medieval tradition usually assigned them? What if commanders chose terrain that channeled enemy cavalry into restricted corridors where their mobility was negated? These were not revolutionary ideas in isolation, but the systematic application of all of them together, specifically as a counter to a specific known enemy, represented a genuine evolution in Polish military thinking. Duke Leszek II, called the Black, who governed a region of Kraków in the years leading up to the 1287 invasion, was the man who inherited this transformed kingdom and was prepared to defend it. His reputation in Polish history has sometimes been overshadowed by more flamboyant figures, but the events of 1287 and 1288 reveal a commander of considerable strategic intelligence. When his scouts brought word in the autumn of 1287 that Mongol armies were massing on the eastern border, his response was the opposite of panic. It was methodical, deliberate, almost surgical. He knew from the intelligence his network had gathered that the invading force would be substantial.
Estimates suggest approximately 30,000 warriors divided into two operational columns. Talabuga Khan would lead the larger force of around 20,000 men, including contingents of Ruthenian vassals under Mongol command, northward towards Sandomir and the upper reaches of Lesser Poland. Nogai Khan, commanding roughly 10,000 elite Mongol and Turkic cavalry, would drive toward Kraków from a southern approach. The strategy was identical in its logic to the 1241 invasion: divide, overwhelm, plunder, and withdraw before a unified defense could be organized. Leszek understood this, and his response was built on three interlocking principles that fed into each other in sequence. First, deny the Mongols easy victories by garrisoning the stone fortresses with determined defenders who were ordered to hold, regardless of what happened outside the walls. Second, deploy Mongol light forces to harass Mongol raiding parties, making it dangerous and costly for the invaders to disperse their army for looting, which the Mongols would inevitably need to do because a force of 30,000 men could not sustain itself from a single operational center. Third, once the Mongols were slowed, frustrated, stretched thin, and losing cohesion, deliver a concentrated counterstrike at the moment and place of Polish choosing. This was not the defensive strategy of a commander who feared his enemy. It was the strategy of a commander who understood his enemy completely and had designed a response that turned Mongol strengths into liabilities. The invasion began in early December 1287. Talabuga's column crossed into Polish territory from the east with the terrible efficiency that Mongol armies had always brought to their opening campaigns. Villages in their path simply ceased to exist. Farms were stripped. Livestock was driven off or killed. Anyone who could not flee fast enough disappeared into the columns of slaves that marched with every Mongol army. The psychological shockwave ran ahead of the physical destruction. Refugees pouring into fortified towns brought tales of a horde too vast to count, moving too fast to escape. And then Talabuga's army reached Sandomir. In 1241, Sandomir had fallen rapidly. In 1259, it had fallen again. The Mongol commanders had no reason to expect anything different in 1287. They launched their assault with the confidence of veterans executing a familiar operation. What they found was a city that bore no resemblance to the target they had expected. The stone walls absorbed arrow fire without effect. The towers that looked down on the attacking formations were manned by crossbowmen who could reach targets that the Mongol horse archers could not match at comparable range. Assault after assault broke against the defenses. Siege equipment was brought forward and met with catapult stones that scattered formations and killed horses. The garrison, ordered to hold and holding, watched the greatest cavalry force in the world rage uselessly against walls that would not break. This was the first crack, not in the walls of Sandomir, but in Mongol certainty. Talabuga made a pragmatic decision. If Sandomir would not fall quickly, the army would redirect toward softer targets and attempt to fulfill its raiding mission through dispersal. The column shifted toward the Świętokrzyski mountains, seeking the vulnerable countryside and the rich monastery at Wislica. But here the second element of Leszek's strategy engaged. Local Polish forces, mobile and familiar with the terrain, began a campaign of constant harassment. They did not seek a decisive engagement. They struck at Mongol raiding parties that had separated from the main body, cutting them off, ambushing them in forested terrain where cavalry could not maneuver freely, and then disappearing before the main force could respond. Every small detachment the Mongols sent to plunder a village or strip a farm ran the risk of not coming back.
This was psychologically corrosive in ways that are easy to underestimate. Mongol armies were not composed of conscripted men who could be kept in the field through fear of execution if they retreated. They were warriors who fought because they expected to win, and who expected to win because they always had.
The accumulated weight of Sandomierzy's refusal to fall, combined with the steady attrition of raiding parties that disappeared into the Polish countryside without returning, created a creeping awareness that this campaign was not following the familiar script. Something had changed. The army that had always been the hunter was beginning to feel, for the first time, like it might be the prey. It was near the Świętokrzyskie Mountains at a place called Węgów on approximately the 20th of December 1287 that the trap fully closed on Talabuga's column. Leszek had been watching. He had been tracking the Mongol column's movements through his intelligence network, noting where it had been slowed, where its raiding parties had been depleted, where the terrain began to work against cavalry tactics. When he identified the right moment, the Mongol column's main strength diminished by the raiding parties it had sent out and not gotten back, the terrain channeling it into ground where flanking maneuvers were difficult. He committed his forces. What happened at Węgów was not a repeat of Legnica. Polish cavalry did not charge recklessly across open ground and expose their flanks. They used the terrain. They absorbed the opening Mongol attacks with disciplined defensive formations rather than pursuing feigned retreats. When Mongol horse archers tried to ride around the Polish flanks, they found themselves funneled into corridors where Polish crossbows and armored heavy cavalry could engage them at close range, where the Mongols' advantage in mounted archery became irrelevant and Polish armored infantry and cavalry became dominant. The battle was long. It was brutal. It was exactly the grinding, attritional engagement that Mongol commanders had always maneuvered to avoid. And when it ended, Talabuga's forces were in retreat. Not a tactical withdrawal to better ground, not a strategic redeployment. A retreat driven by losses they had not expected to absorb and could not sustain. Polish chronicles describe the defeat as severe. By the standards of medieval understatement, that means catastrophic. Talabuga pulled his shattered column back toward Kielce and eventually all the way to the winter camp at Lwów. The army that had entered Poland with 30 years of unbroken confidence in its own invincibility withdrew with something it had almost never carried before, the knowledge of defeat. But the campaign was not over, because while Talabuga's column was retreating eastward, Nogai Khan's 10,000 elite warriors were approaching Kraków from the south, entirely unaware that the northern column had already been broken. It was Christmas Eve of 1287 that Nogai's forces appeared before the walls of Kraków. The date has a particular resonance, though whether the Mongol commanders were aware of its significance to the people they were attacking is unknown. What mattered to Nogai was military logic. Kraków had been taken twice. His forces were fresh and composed entirely of elite Mongol and Turkic cavalry, no Ruthenian auxiliaries whose loyalty to the Mongol cause might be questionable. The operation should have been straightforward. What Nogai found instead stopped his army in its tracks before the assault even properly began. The walls that rose before him were not the wooden palisades of 1241. They were not even the Modet upgraded defenses that had stood in 1259. What Wawel Hill now presented to the Mongol army was a genuine fortress, thick stone walls, stone towers, and along every section of those walls, the unmistakable shapes of crossbows and catapults, all pointed outward, all manned by garrison soldiers who had been specifically ordered to hold this city at any cost. Nogai ordered the assault anyway. His cavalry rode forward in the rolling waves that Mongol commanders used to exhaust defenders, not committing everything at once, but maintaining constant pressure across multiple approach angles. The horse archers rode close to the walls and unleashed their volleys, and the walls answered. Crossbow bolts reached the attacking cavalry at ranges they had not expected. Catapult stones crashed into formations, killing horses, breaking ranks, sending men sprawling across the frozen ground outside Krakow's walls. When assault parties tried to approach with ladders and rams, they found themselves in a kill zone from which there was no safe angle of approach. The assault failed. They tried again. It failed again, and again, and again. The siege of Kraków became something the Mongols had almost no experience dealing with, a military operation that was going nowhere, consuming men and supplies at an unsustainable rate, with no end in sight. Every day that passed was a day Polish relief forces could be gathering. The operational logic that had always made Mongol raids successful, speed, shock, quick plunder, quick withdrawal, was being systematically destroyed by walls that would not cooperate with the script.
Contemporary sources record that the Mongols suffered heavy casualties at Kraków and lost several of their commanders during the siege attempts. This detail is remarkable. The men who led Mongol armies were not the kind of commanders who died easily. They were professionals in an army where professional competence was ruthlessly selected for over generations. To lose multiple commanders at a single siege spoke to the ferocity of the Polish defense and the desperation of the Mongol assault. It was during this period that the legend of the Wiślany raftsmen entered Polish historical memory. According to the tradition that was passed down through generations, a group of tough river workers from the community near Kraków, men who made their living transporting goods on the Vistula River and who were called Wawel's defenders in some versions of the story, discovered the location of a Mongol command encampment outside the city's walls. Rather than waiting passively inside the safety of the fortifications, these men launched a nighttime raid on the Mongol camp and, according to the legend, killed several of the commanders who were directing the siege operations against Kraków. Whether every detail of this story is historically accurate in the way that modern scholarship demands is debated, but what is certain is that the siege failed, that the Mongol command suffered unusual losses, and that Nogai's army withdrew from Kraków having achieved nothing at all. The kernel of historical truth inside the legend is hard to dismiss entirely. Faced with the complete failure of his siege, Nogai made the decision that any rational commander would make under the circumstances. He dispersed his forces into smaller raiding columns and attempted to salvage something from the campaign by plundering the countryside north and south of Kraków in regions that were not protected by stone fortifications. This was a logical response to tactical failure, but it was also exactly what Leszek II had anticipated, and it triggered the third and final phase of the Polish defensive strategy. Duke Leszek, having broken Talabuga's column at Węgów, moved his forces south with speed. He was not moving alone. In the weeks since the invasion began, he had dispatched urgent messengers to Hungary, invoking the military alliance between the two kingdoms and calling for immediate reinforcement. The Hungarian response came from Voivode György Baksa, who led an experienced heavy cavalry force north across the Carpathian passes to join the Polish army. The Hungarians had their own reasons to hate the Mongols. The 1241 invasion had killed somewhere between 20 and 40% of Hungary's total population, a demographic catastrophe comparable in scale to the Black Death. Hungarian knights riding to Poland's defense were not simply honoring a diplomatic obligation, they were settling a generational debt. The combined Polish-Hungarian army that Leszek assembled in January of 1288 was a force built for exactly the kind of operation that now presented itself. Nogai's dispersed raiding columns were spread across southern Poland, each one isolated, unaware of how drastically the strategic situation had shifted, confident that they were merely conducting the final profitable phase of a successful campaign. They did not know that Talabuga had been defeated. They did not know that Kraków had held. They did not know that a concentrated enemy army was hunting them. A Mongol detachment of approximately 1,000 warriors was engaged in besieging the town of Stary Sącz when the combined Polish-Hungarian force found them.
The ambush was executed with the kind of completeness that the Mongols themselves had so often achieved against others. Complete surprise, no warning, no time for the target force to organize a defense or execute any kind of tactical response. The Allied army hit the Mongol detachment from multiple directions simultaneously, and what followed was not a battle in any meaningful sense, it was a massacre. The entire Mongol force at Stadi Sanch was annihilated. Their commander was killed. Not a cavalry screen pushed back, not a fighting withdrawal to better ground. Annihilation. When word of Stadi Sanch reached Nogai Khan, the full catastrophic scale of the campaign's failure became impossible to deny. Talabuga had been defeated and had retreated. Kraków had refused to fall. The raiding columns that were supposed to be the consolation prize of a difficult campaign were being hunted and destroyed by a Polish-Hungarian force that was stronger than anything the invasion's planners had expected to encounter. The cost-benefit calculation of remaining in Poland had collapsed entirely. There was nothing left to gain and everything left to lose. In late January of 1288, Nogai gathered what remained of his forces and began the long march back to Ruthenia. He was not leading a victorious army returning laden with plunder. He was not even leading a professional army that had fought well in a difficult campaign and withdrawn in good order. He was leading a broken force that had failed at every strategic objective it had been assigned, that had lost commanders and men in numbers that could not be easily replaced, and that carried with it the worst cargo any army can bear, the knowledge that the enemy it had underestimated was capable of defeating it.
The Mongol chronicles are, tellingly, nearly silent about the 1287-1288 campaign in Poland. Empires that document their conquests extensively rarely celebrate their defeats with the same enthusiasm. The absence of detailed Mongol accounts of this campaign is itself a kind of testimony to what had happened. What had happened, when you strip away the individual battles and look at the strategic picture, was a comprehensive failure of a military system that had not encountered meaningful adaptation before. The Mongols had crossed into Poland expecting the kingdom they had devastated twice. What they found was a kingdom that had used those devastations as lessons. Every burned city had become a stone fortress. Every failed cavalry charge had become a doctrine of defensive discipline. Every political fragmentation that had prevented coordinated resistance had been replaced by centralized command under a single strategically capable duke. And every alliance that had failed to materialize in time in 1241 had been pre-negotiated and activated in 1287. Polish historian Stefan Krakowski, whose detailed analysis of this campaign remains among the most thorough in the scholarly literature, identified two primary factors in the Mongol failure. The first was internal division. Talabuga and Nogai were not merely co-commanders, they were rivals, each with his own ambitions and his own sense of how the campaign should be conducted. The two columns operated essentially independently, with poor coordination and slower communication than the Mongols' reputation for organizational efficiency might suggest. When Talabuga was defeated and retreated, Nogai did not know about it immediately. He continued pressing his siege of Kraków without the support his northern column was supposed to provide, and without the ability to adapt his strategy to the reality that half the invasion force had already been broken. The second and more structurally profound factor was the stone fortifications. Krakowski emphasizes that this single element, the decision to rebuild in stone after 1259, fundamentally altered the operational mathematics of a Mongol invasion. The Mongol system depended on rapid movement and rapid plunder. It could not sustain prolonged sieges without consuming its own logistical base. The moment Sandomierz held and Kraków held, the invasion's timeline became untenable.
Every day spent battering against walls that would not yield was a day the campaign fell further behind the schedule it needed to maintain in order to withdraw before winter made the operation impossible. The stone fortresses did not need to defeat the Mongol army, they only needed to hold. The Polish field forces would do the rest. After 1288, the Mongols never again launched a major invasion of Poland. The historical record is clear on this point. The Golden Horde, which continued to be a significant power in the region for generations afterward, redirected its raiding energies toward territories that offered better returns at lower costs. Poland had ceased to be the easy prey it had once been, and the Mongols were nothing if not pragmatic about where they invested their military resources. Within Poland itself, the victory of 1287-1288 had consequences that stretched far beyond the military. The campaign had demonstrated in the most concrete possible terms that Polish forces operating under unified command could defeat the most feared army in the world. The political implications were significant. The fragmentation of Polish territory into competing duchies, which had been a source of military vulnerability for so long, was increasingly impossible to defend on practical grounds in the aftermath of a war that had been won precisely because a single duke had imposed strategic coherence on the defense. The momentum toward political reunification, which scholars have traced through the late 13th and early 14th centuries, was not caused solely by the Mongol Wars, but those wars provided the most visceral possible argument for why fragmentation was dangerous. In 1320, Władysław I, called the Short, was crowned King of Poland, restoring unified monarchy for the first time in over a century. The cultural memory of the 1287-1288 campaign has proven extraordinarily durable. The Lykonic Parade, held annually in Kraków on the first Thursday after the Feast of Corpus Christi, keeps a version of that memory alive in a form that has survived 7 centuries. A man dressed in elaborate Tartar costume, riding a decorated hobby horse, leads a procession through the streets of the old city, accompanied by musicians and crowds of spectators. The specifics of the legend that the parade commemorates, the raftsmen who raided the Mongol camp, the commanders who were killed, the siege that was broken, may contain embellishments that grew over centuries of retelling. But the underlying historical reality that the parade celebrates is entirely accurate. Kraków did hold. The Mongols did fail. Something remarkable did happen outside those stone walls in the winter of 1287, and Polish culture decided correctly that it was worth remembering forever.
There is something deeply instructive in the contrast between how the two sides remembered this campaign. The Mongols forgot it, or tried to. The Poles made it into a festival that continues to this day. Defeat, when it comes to a power that had never known defeat before, is something to be buried. Victory, especially an unexpected victory against an enemy that had seemed invincible, becomes something foundational. It becomes proof that the impossible is possible. It becomes the story a nation tells itself about what it is capable of. And what Poland was capable of in the winter of 1287 and 1288 was something that 46 years of terror had not managed to produce: the complete, methodical, devastating defeat of the greatest cavalry force the medieval world had ever seen. Not through luck, not through miraculous intervention, through preparation, intelligence, discipline, and the refusal to make the same catastrophic mistakes that previous generations had made. The 30,000 warriors who crossed into Poland in December of 1287 brought with them a legacy of conquest that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the banks of the Danube. They brought tactics that had broken empires. They brought confidence built from decades of victories against enemies far larger and better equipped than anything Poland could field. And they found, in the end, that none of it was enough, because the enemy they were fighting was not the Poland of 1241.
It was a Poland that had been rebuilt, remade, and reimagined specifically to defeat them. They found stone where they expected wood. They found discipline where they expected panic. They found coordination where they expected fragmentation. And they found, waiting for them in the frozen passes of the Świętokrzyskie Mountains and on the banks of the rivers south of Kraków, an enemy that had learned everything the Mongols had taught it and had turned those lessons into a trap from which there was no escape. In 1241, Poland burned, and the Mongols rode home in triumph. In 1288, the Mongols fled through the winter snow, and Poland stood amid the wreckage of their ambitions, unbroken. The stone held, the people held, and the most feared army in the history of the medieval world learned at last that there were places it could not go. But to truly understand the magnitude of what Poland accomplished in those frozen months of 1287 and 1288, we cannot simply count the battles and declare a winner. We must go deeper. We must ask the question that historians so rarely pause long enough to answer properly. What does it actually feel like to be on the losing side of history? What was it like to be a Mongol warrior in the winter of 1288, riding away from a kingdom that had twice before bent before you, now retreating through snow and bitter wind, with the unthinkable weight of failure pressing down on everything you believed about yourself and your people? Because understanding that experience, the psychological collapse of an army that had never learned how to lose, is essential to understanding why the events of 1288 carried consequences that stretched far beyond the borders of Poland and far beyond the lifetime of anyone who fought in those battles. The Mongol warrior's identity was inseparable from victory. This was not simply a matter of cultural pride in the way that modern nations take pride in their armies. It was structural. It was foundational. The entire social and political architecture of the Mongol Empire had been built on the premise that the Mongol army was unstoppable. Tribute flowed into the Golden Horde because the kingdoms and principalities that paid it had no confidence that resistance would do anything except make their eventual subjugation more violent. Potential enemies chose submission over defiance, not because they lacked the desire to resist, but because the historical record seemed to offer no example of successful resistance. The Mongols had never lost a war. They had suffered setbacks. The Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt had halted their advance, was the most famous. But even those setbacks had not shattered the fundamental aura of inevitability that surrounded Mongol expansion. That aura was a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon the Mongol Empire possessed. It made enemies surrender before the first arrow was fired. It made cities open their gates when the Mongol vanguard appeared on the horizon, because the residents had heard what happened to cities that chose to fight. The reputation of absolute power had military value that could not be easily quantified, but was absolutely real. And the campaign of 1287 and 1288 had damaged that reputation in a way that no subsequent propaganda campaign could fully repair. The warriors who rode home from Poland in January of 1288 would return to communities that had sent them forth expecting the usual reward of a successful raid: slaves, treasure, livestock, the practical fruits of conquest that sustained the Mongol economy of the western steppes. Instead, they returned with nothing. Worse than nothing, because they returned with losses, men who had not come back, commanders who had died outside walls that should have fallen, horses exhausted and diminished by a campaign that had consumed everything and produced nothing. The conversations that happened in those camps, in those gurs, around those fires, as veterans tried to explain what had gone wrong, would have been profoundly difficult. Not merely because failure was embarrassing, but because the Mongol conceptual framework for understanding military operations had no comfortable category for what had happened. They had not been outmaneuvered in the open field. They had not been overwhelmed by superior numbers. They had been stopped by walls, by discipline, by an enemy that had studied them.
And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling thing of all about the Polish victory of 1288. It was not a victory that the Mongols could attribute to luck or weather or the intervention of some external force beyond their control. It was a victory that had been deliberately engineered by an enemy that understood them. The Poles had looked at the Mongol system, identified its weaknesses, and built a defense specifically calibrated to exploit those weaknesses. The feigned retreat worked because defenders panicked and pursued, so Polish commanders trained their men not to pursue. Mongol mobility was devastating in open ground, so Polish commanders chose ground where mobility was restricted. Mongol armies could not sustain prolonged sieges, so Poland built fortifications specifically designed to force prolonged sieges. Every element of the Polish response was a direct, intelligent answer to a specific Mongol capability. The Mongols had been defeated not by an act of God, but by an act of mind. To grasp why this mattered so profoundly in the broader context of medieval geopolitics, consider what Europe looked like in the years immediately following the first great Mongol invasions of 1241. The terror was not merely local to Poland and Hungary, it was continental. Chroniclers from France, England, Germany, and the Italian city-states wrote about the Mongol advance with a mixture of horror and apocalyptic foreboding that reads, 7 centuries later, as something close to existential despair. The Pope called for crusades. Rulers frantically attempted to forge alliances. Scholars debated whether the Mongols might be the legendary armies of Gog and Magog from the Book of Revelation, prophesied to appear at the end of days and consume the civilized world. The level of genuine terror in European culture was profound and not entirely irrational. The Mongols had destroyed everything between the Pacific and the Carpathians. There was no obvious reason to believe they would stop at the Carpathians. And then, after the first invasion, they did stop, though not because of European resistance. Nogai Khan, son of Genghis and supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, died in December of 1241, and the resulting succession crisis forced Batu Khan and Subutai to withdraw their armies from Europe to participate in the political process of selecting a new great Khan. Europe was saved in 1241 not by its own efforts, but by Mongol politics. This was a fact that thoughtful European observers recognized with uncomfortable clarity. They had not won, they had been lucky. The psychological shadow that cast over European military thinking for the following decades was enormous. The Mongols would come back. Everyone knew they would come back. And next time, there might be no convenient political crisis to rescue the continent. The questions that haunted European rulers were fundamental. Could Mongol armies be defeated by European forces in open battle? Were the tactics that had worked against every other enemy simply beyond the capacity of medieval European armies to counter? Was the appropriate response to build stronger walls, to develop new weapons, to forge broader alliances, or was there simply no response that would work? Poland, more than any other European kingdom, had the most direct and painful relationship with these questions, and Poland, more than any other European kingdom, actually answered them. Not in theory, not in military treatises or the speculations of scholars, in the snow and blood of December 1287 and January 1288, with stone walls and crossbow bolts, and the disciplined courage of men who had decided collectively that their civilization would not be destroyed a third time. The news of what had happened spread across Europe with remarkable speed for the medieval period, carried by merchants and pilgrims and diplomatic couriers along the trade routes that connected the continent's major centers of power. And the reaction, pieced together from chronicles and letters of the period, was something close to stunned relief. The Mongols had been stopped, not turned back by political accident, not deflected by weather or plague, stopped by a Polish army that had fought them, held its ground, and driven them away. If Poland could do it, the implication was clear. The Mongol threat, while still formidable, was not the absolute and unchallengeable force of nature that the events of 1241 had suggested. There were limits, there were vulnerabilities, there were methods.
This shift in European strategic consciousness was not immediate or complete. The Mongol threat remained real and would continue to shape Eastern European politics for generations. But the 1288 campaign introduced into European thinking something that had been entirely absent before: the demonstrated possibility of successful resistance. That possibility, once established, was impossible to unestablish. It changed how rulers thought about defense, about fortification, about the value of military alliances, about the relationship between short-term expense and long-term security. The massive investment that Poland had made in rebuilding its fortifications over the previous 4 decades seemed, to some contemporary observers, almost recklessly expensive. After 1288, it looked like the most efficient military expenditure in European history.
It is worth dwelling for a moment on the specific figures who made the Polish victory possible, because history has a tendency to celebrate outcomes while forgetting the individuals who shaped them through years of unglamorous work. Duke Leszek II the Black is the most obvious candidate for recognition, and he deserves everything that can be said about his strategic leadership in the 1287-1288 campaign. But Leszek was the inheritor of a transformation that had begun before his time, and that required the sustained commitment of multiple rulers across multiple decades. Bolesław V the Chaste, who ruled in the immediate aftermath of the 1259 invasion and initiated much of the rebuilding program, deserves more credit than he typically receives in popular accounts of this period. The decision to rebuild in stone was his generation's decision, and it required his generation's resources and political will to implement. The stone walls that stopped Nogai at Kraków in 1287 had been planned and built during Bolesław's reign, largely on his authority and at his insistence. The military commanders who trained Polish cavalry in the doctrine of defensive discipline, who drilled men to hold their positions when every instinct screamed at them to charge, who developed the tactics that turned Mongol strengths into liabilities at Węgów, remain largely nameless in the historical record, as such men almost always do. But their contribution was as real as the contribution of the stone masons who raised the walls of Wawel Castle. The physical fortifications and the human discipline that defended them were equal partners in the Polish system of defense. And then there were the ordinary soldiers, the garrison troops who manned the walls of Sandomierz and Kraków through weeks of assault, who watched Mongol armies break against their defenses and held their positions when the psychological pressure of facing 30,000 enemies outside their gates must have been almost unbearable. Medieval chronicles generally do not record the names of common soldiers. They record the names of dukes and knights and commanders, but the Polish victory of 1288 was won as much by the anonymous crossbowmen on the walls of Kraków as by the strategic genius of Leszek II. Both were necessary. Neither alone would have been sufficient. The Hungarian contribution also deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts that focus primarily on the Polish perspective. Voivode György Baksa's decision to respond quickly to Leszek's call for aid, to bring his cavalry north through the Carpathian passes in the depth of winter, was not a trivial military undertaking. The passes were difficult and dangerous in that season, and moving an effective cavalry force through them required logistics and organizational competence of a high order. But Baksa had his own reasons for urgency. The Mongols had devastated Hungary in 1241 with a thoroughness that made what they did to Poland look almost restrained by comparison. The Hungarian plain, with its open terrain ideal for Mongol cavalry tactics, had been essentially defenseless against the invasion. King Bela IV had fled to an island in the Adriatic to escape capture. The destruction had been so complete, so total, that Hungary spent decades simply trying to repopulate the regions that had been emptied by Mongol violence.
Like Poland, Hungary had drawn lessons from that catastrophe. Like Poland, it had invested in stone fortifications and reformed its military doctrine in the years following 1241. And like Poland, it had developed the political will to actually use those reformed capabilities when the moment came. The Polish-Hungarian alliance of 1287-1288 was not merely a diplomatic convenience. It was the product of two nations that had survived the same ordeal, drawn the same conclusions, and built compatible defensive systems that could work together in the field. When they came together at Stary Sącz to annihilate the Mongol raiding column, they were executing a combined operation that neither could have achieved alone, and that both had, in different ways, been preparing for since the 1240s. The battle at Stary Sącz itself, though smaller in scale than the engagement at Węgów, deserves particular attention because of what it represented tactically. The Mongols who were besieging that small town when the combined Polish-Hungarian force arrived believed themselves to be in exactly the kind of operational situation that Mongol doctrine prescribed as ideal: a relatively small force conducting a focused plunder operation in territory that was not expected to contain significant enemy forces. They were experienced warriors executing a familiar mission. What they were not doing was maintaining the kind of all-around security that a force operating in contested territory should maintain, because they did not believe they were in contested territory. They believed the local resistance had been broken. They believed the strategic situation was under control. They believed, in short, exactly what Leszek wanted them to believe.
The Mongol instinct toward compartmentalization of information, the operational security that had made their intelligence networks so effective in planning invasions, worked against them here. The raiding detachments that Nogai had dispersed after the failed siege of Kraków did not necessarily know how comprehensively the campaign had failed in the north. They did not know that Talabuga had been broken at Węgów. They had limited information about where the Polish field army was and what it was doing, and so they continued executing their mission with confidence right up until the moment that confidence became lethal. The complete surprise achieved at Stary Sącz, which contemporary sources emphasize explicitly, not as a rhetorical flourish but as a specific military fact, was the product of careful Polish operational planning. Leszek had maintained good intelligence about where Nogai's dispersed columns were operating. He had moved his combined force with enough speed to prevent the target detachment from receiving warning, and he had chosen his moment carefully, committing to the engagement only when he was confident of overwhelming superiority at the decisive point. These were not the instincts of a commander reacting to events. They were the decisions of a commander who was shaping events according to a plan. The parallels with Mongol operational doctrine are striking and, one suspects, intentional. The Mongols had always won through superior intelligence, superior speed, and the ability to concentrate force at points where the enemy was unprepared. At Stary Sącz, a Polish commander used precisely those same principles against a Mongol force that had not expected to become a target. The hunter had become the hunted, not through any mystical reversal of fortune, but through the deliberate application of lessons learned from observing and surviving the most successful military machine of the medieval age. This brings us to a broader point about the nature of military learning that the Polish experience of the 13th century illustrates with unusual clarity. Military organizations, whether the armies of medieval kingdoms or the forces of modern states, have a pronounced tendency toward what scholars of organizational behavior call competency traps. A competency trap occurs when an organization becomes so successful using a particular set of methods that it loses the flexibility to adapt when those methods stop working.
The methods that produced past success become institutionalized, culturally embedded, and eventually invisible, treated not as specific choices that were appropriate in specific circumstances, but as permanent truths about how things should be done. And when the environment changes in ways that make those methods ineffective, the organization struggles to recognize what is happening and adapt in time. The Mongol Empire in the mid to late 13th century was exhibiting the early symptoms of this syndrome. The tactical methods that had made it dominant, mobile cavalry warfare, feigned retreats, dispersed raiding followed by concentrated assault, had worked so consistently for so long against so many different enemies that Mongol commanders had largely stopped questioning them. They were the right way to fight. They had always been the right way to fight. The possibility that an enemy might have studied those methods and built specific countermeasures against them was apparently not a scenario that Mongol operational planning in 1287 had seriously entertained. This was not stupidity. The Mongol commanders who planned the 1287 invasion were not fools. They were experienced professionals who had spent their careers fighting effectively against a wide variety of enemies. But they were also products of a military culture whose success had insulated it from the need to adapt. When the Mongols had invaded Poland before, the Poles had not adapted effectively. Why would they be different this time? The logical inference from historical experience said they would not be. The logical inference was wrong. Poland, by contrast, had been forced into exactly the kind of painful institutional learning that produces genuine adaptation. The first invasion destroyed the comfortable assumptions that Polish military culture had built up over generations. The second invasion, coming less than 20 years later, made it unmistakably clear that the first invasion was not an anomaly, but a template that would be repeated until Poland changed something fundamental about the way it defended itself. The trauma was severe enough, and the stakes were clearly high enough, that the normal institutional resistance to change was overcome. Nobody argued that the old wooden walls had served Poland well for generations and deserved to be preserved. Nobody insisted that the traditional aggressive cavalry charge was the honorable approach and that defensive discipline was somehow cowardly or un-Polish. The pragmatic imperative, survive or be destroyed, cut through cultural conservatism with a clarity that less existential pressures rarely produce. This dynamic, the role of catastrophic failure in forcing genuine adaptation, appears repeatedly in military history. It is a deeply uncomfortable truth because it suggests that the very worst experiences, the defeats that destroy armies and burn cities and kill thousands of people, can serve, in the long run, as the mechanism through which civilizations develop the capabilities they need to survive. Poland had not the luxury of learning from theoretical exercises or minor setbacks. It learned from catastrophe, and the knowledge purchased at such terrible cost was integrated into the kingdom's military architecture with a thoroughness and a seriousness of purpose that more comfortable circumstances might not have produced.
The legacy of the 1287-1288 campaign rippled outward from Poland in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, but impossible to deny entirely. The principle of stone fortification as a counter to mobile cavalry had, of course, been understood in various forms well before the Mongol invasions. The castle-building traditions of Western Europe and the Byzantine fortification systems both predated the Mongol threat. But the Polish experience gave that principle a new and concrete demonstration in the specific context of resisting the most mobile and tactically sophisticated cavalry force the medieval world had produced. Other kingdoms in Eastern Europe that faced Mongol pressure in the decades following 1288 had a Polish example to study. The lesson: build in stone, train for discipline, plan for prolonged defense rather than decisive field engagement, and seek allies who bring complementary capabilities, was available for any ruler who chose to learn from it. Within Poland itself, the decades following the 1288 campaign saw a continuation and deepening of the defensive transformation that had made the victory possible.
The castle-building program that had been initiated in response to the first invasion and that had produced the fortifications that stopped the Mongols in 1287 continued to expand. The system of stone fortifications that eventually became known as the Trail of Eagles' Nests, a chain of castles along the limestone hills of Lesser Poland, has its roots in precisely this period of deliberate, strategic construction. These were not vanity projects or expressions of aristocratic status. They were operational infrastructure, planned and built by rulers who understood that geography and fortification, properly combined, could neutralize the advantages of even the most capable enemy. The political reunification of Poland that culminated in the coronation of Władysław I the Short in 1320 was, as previously noted, influenced by multiple factors beyond the Mongol Wars. Economic development, dynastic politics, the ambitions of individual rulers, and the evolving relationship between the Polish Church and Rome all played roles in the long process of reunification. But the military argument for unity, that fragmented command had proven fatal in 1241 and that unified command had proven decisive in 1287, was available to everyone who participated in the reunification debates of the late 13th and early 14th centuries. It was an argument grounded not in theory, but in the lived experience of people who were still alive to remember both what fragmentation had cost and what unity had achieved. The reunified Polish kingdom that emerged from this process would go on to become one of the major powers of late medieval and early modern Europe. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which eventually emerged from the union of Poland with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in 1386, would at its height be one of the largest political entities in European history, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state that exercised power from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The trajectory that led to that outcome was long and complex and shaped by many forces. But somewhere near its beginning, there are the stone walls of Kraków standing in the winter of 1287, and the soldiers who manned them, and the duke who understood that his kingdom's survival depended not on matching the Mongols in the kind of warfare at which the Mongols excelled, but on forcing the Mongols to fight the kind of warfare at which Poland excelled. There is a moment in the history of every civilization that serves as a kind of hinge, a point at which things could have gone either way, and the direction they actually went shaped everything that followed. For medieval Poland, that hinge point was the winter of 1287 and 1288. If Kraków had fallen for a third time, the political will to continue rebuilding and resisting might have been broken beyond repair. If Leszek II had been defeated in the field at Węgów and the Polish field army destroyed, the garrisoned cities would eventually have had to negotiate or surrender. If the Hungarian reinforcements had arrived too late or not at all, the Mongol raiding columns might have plundered enough of southern Poland to make the campaign a tactical success, even if the strategic objectives were not achieved. None of those things happened. The walls held, the army won, the Allies arrived in time. And Poland survived to become something that neither the Mongols of 1241 nor the demoralized survivors of that first catastrophic invasion could have easily imagined. A kingdom capable of stopping the unstoppable. 700 years later, the people of Kraków still gather every year to watch the Lykanik parade through the streets of their ancient city. The man in the Tatar costume, riding his decorated horse, strikes people with his mace to bring them good luck, a custom whose origins are debated but whose symbolism is clear. The enemy has been reduced from a source of existential terror to a figure of celebration, someone to be mocked affectionately, a reminder of a threat that came and was defeated and went away and never came back. That transformation from the darkest imaginable fear to something almost playful is itself a kind of victory. It is what survival looks like across the long arc of history. Not merely the military fact of having stopped an invasion in a particular winter, but the cultural confidence of a people who know, because their ancestors proved it, that they cannot be destroyed. The Mongol army that rode away from Poland in January of 1288 was, by any measure, still one of the most formidable military forces on earth. The Golden Horde would continue to exercise enormous power across the Eurasian steppe for generations. The Mongol legacy would shape the politics and culture of Russia, Central Asia, China, and the Middle East for centuries. The 1288 campaign was not the end of the Mongol Empire. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was something smaller, and in some ways more significant. It was the moment when the empire that had never been stopped was stopped. When the army that always won was beaten. When the walls that were supposed to be wood were stone. And the soldiers who were supposed to panic held their ground. And the nation that was supposed to be easy prey turned around and fought back. Poland remembered. The Mongols tried to forget. And 7 centuries later, that asymmetry of memory tells you everything you need to know about who really won.